Okay, today my guest is Professor Subi Rangan. I will keep my introduction short to maximize our time with him. In the next 30 minutes or so, we'll talk about Subi as a person, Professor Rangan is a thought leader and an esteemed scholar, and finally is a mentor to many PhD students and junior faculty. And for the sake of time, I'll be very brief with the introduction. Subi is the Professor of Strategy and Management at INSEAD, and he was Associate Editor of AMR and Chair of the World Economic Forum's Global Agenda Council on Emerging Multinationals. In 2018, he launched the Integrating Performance and Progress, IPP, executive seminar that he co-teaches with philosophers. In 2013, he initiated the Society for Progress, a fellowship of eminent philosophers, social scientists, and business leaders of foreign transnational firms and these firms' non-market strategies. His current work explores how enterprises may better integrate performance and progress and how scholars may help evolve the paradigm and practice of capitalism. Thank you, Subi, for joining us.
Thank you, Ilgas. I'm looking forward to this. This is great.
So, Subi, first question always is, what did you want to become when you were a child?
You know, to be honest, there was no particular thing that I wanted to become when I was a child. Just wanted to stay out of trouble and have fun. But as a youth, I think when I was about 14, 15, then I really wanted to serve in the military, in the Indian military. And I almost made it, but fate had other plans for me. So.
And can you pinpoint the earliest moment of awareness between domestic versus international?
You know, there are two moments that I think for anybody who grows up in at least a city like Bombay, Mumbai in India, Bollywood is so present. And Bollywood movies always had these, they would go on location. This is how Indians traveled through Bollywood movies. And you would see these amazing, mostly it was, I think, Switzerland or some, scenic place like that. So that's when you realize, wow, there's this whole thing called foreign. Now, that was really as a child. And I was just fascinated by things like snow and mountains and all of this highways and fast cars and things like that. But one day, quite young, maybe I was 11 or 12 or something, there was, through some friend, a German traveler came to our house. And I had never met a foreign person before that. This young German was the first person, and I think his name was Walter. And the particular thing, everything about Walter fascinated me, but the particular thing was, it was, I think, sometime the rainy season, and Walter had an umbrella. Now you would say, what is this about this umbrella and the foreign? Ilgas, this was the first folding umbrella I had ever seen. His umbrella folded like as small, like a Japanese, maybe they have that, but this was from Germany. And I was so completely fascinated by the technology because India monsoon, umbrellas are like crucial, and especially in Bombay. And looking at this saying, this is what, there is something else on the other side, outside India, which has these magic kind of products. And so that was when I kind of realized that there is India and we can't find this in India, and maybe India doesn't make it, or if they do, I can't, get that. So that's when I kind of understood, oh, so when he leaves, he goes to the place of these folding umbrellas, which are so small. It was so, because the Indian umbrellas were huge and heavy. And, it was always cumbersome. And I was thinking like, wow, if I had the small umbrella, this would be very handy. So that was
actually all these little small things make such a huge impact in a person's upbringing and later on mental mapping. Okay, what made you choose scholarship in IB and strategy later on?
Well, from maybe already that encounter, I had an interest in international. And so at that time, I thought about, how would I go to that other land? how do I find out more about what lies beyond India? And through some association, I think there was this pen pal association. And you could write, maybe it was in the back of comic books or something, you have to fill out your biographic information. It was like the earliest version of like Tinder. And so at the, impressionable age of 13 or 14, I filled in and sent it in. And you can identify, I think, the country where you want, and I chose the US. And I had this friend then from Seattle, whom one day, 5 years later, I actually met in person and went and stayed with her. But this became my pen pal. And so she was an American, I was an Indian. And after I couldn't get the umbrella, but I got a Texas Instruments calculator. And the problem was we couldn't find 9-volt batteries in India. So I had a calculator that I couldn't quite use. But this whole international fascination really stayed with me. And on the one hand, I wanted to kind of serve in the military, and I was thinking of that. And then by chance, I got an opportunity to go as an exchange student to Canada, which is how I went and ended up meeting. And I went to Victoria, British Columbia as a 17-year-old, and then took a ferry to go to Vancouver, and then also to somehow to Seattle, and met this person, etc. But that was a big exchange program. It was like 4 months in Canada with a Canadian family, and then they came to India with for 4 months. And so we were 14 of us from India, 14 from Canada, and we were together for 8 months. So really quite a bit of time at that young age, 17, when you're quite impressionable and you start to understand that this domestic foreign America, India, and this, I think, put a bug in me. I started reading about international because it somehow had entered me, and I wanted to now go back and study in the US. So coming from India and eventually reading, maybe Time magazine or something like this, and seeing they had some young economists, and one of them was Lester Thoreau. Lester Thoreau was at MIT, and so I went to meet him, and he met me, and all these things kind of started to come together, saying, wow, how does this work? Why is there such a contradiction between my life and the life that I saw there, and how they grew up and how I grew up? And multinational firms seem to be like a bridge. If I could understand them, then I could go from this India to the rest of the world, or at least the West, which was what at that time for me was international. And they were doing interesting things. And I think at that time when I was growing up and having all these thoughts, suddenly one day IBM had to leave India and Coca-Cola had to leave India. India was suddenly closing the border and kind of not nationalizing, but saying majority ownership has to go to Indian owners. And so IBM said, no, we will not be a minority owned company in India. We will be, we would rather leave. Coca-Cola left. And there was this exodus of foreign multinationals that I had somehow, those were the only direct kind of encounters I had with multinational firms, and they had to leave. And this created a kind of puzzle in my mind about macro and micro issues. There's this contradiction of India versus those firms. And then there is something that is happening at a macro level, which affects the micro or firm level kind of decisions and the life and the dreams of young people like me, whether it is, as a consumer, but also as somebody wondering about what is this conflict, and being totally unable to understand how these things happened and what was the role of government. And then eventually I would meet Ray Vernon. But this macro micro really stuck with me from a very young age. And somehow that was, I can't say I wanted to be an IB scholar, but I did not like conflict. I did not like the fact that so-called foreign multinationals would be, abruptly leaving India. And this seemed like there was a certain disagreement. And I would go on to kind of understand why is it that countries have all these dreams and preferences, and then foreign companies have to either accommodate to that, or they have to exit, or so on. And that, I think, stayed with me, this foreign and problem and contradiction, but also a bridge to a better world and a better life, presumably. So all these things kind of seeded me.
So, Subi, if you stop doing what you're doing today, what would you be doing as a second career path? Maybe maybe a different.
I think twice I tried to do something else, and both times I did not manage to succeed. I told you I wanted to serve in the Indian military, and for a variety of family-related reasons, I think I was really good. I had done all the training and everything, and I was definitely selected. But for family reasons, I was dissuaded from that. And then I eventually did all this thing and did the PhD in international political economy. And that was I said, if I can't serve India, maybe I can serve the world through the United Nations and the World Bank or something. So I studied political economy, not to become a professor, but to serve in the international institutions at that time. And that, by the time I graduated, people said, well, there are, probably too many Indians at these international institutions, and you may not easily find a job, or if you do, you may not find it very satisfying, because there's a lot of politics, and it's not so easy to contribute or change. And unfortunately, that still seems to be a view that many people hold. So I couldn't do that, and I ended up becoming a professor. It wasn't the reason why I chose to do a PhD, but that's what happened. And I think today, if I were not that, I would probably still be looking at some international institution. At some point, I had a job offer at McKinsey, so I could imagine, some combination of international work, but service is very important.
Okay. What are you most passionate about?
Well, I would certainly say not my career. And I'd probably say much more my contribution. And growing up in India in a middle-class family, is exactly the right place. You kind of feel super grateful because you see a lot of poverty below. At the same time, you also get to see that there is a lot of work that needs to be done. And both my parents, at some point, my father did his entire career at Tata. And so having that example of Tata, and Tata paid my first scholarship when I went to the US to study. They helped finance that. And so service, Tata in India is an enterprise that is also engaged in huge nation building. And the passion for kind of saying, so that was the role model. That was, how did Tata do this? And what does it take? So you care and you contribute. And you need a lot of competence for that. So, and of course, beyond the competence, the most important thing we bring is energy. And if you have a goal like that, contribution or caring, then I think you get a lot of energy. And in fact, that's what I would say. And in one sense, sometimes you think, what really matters? And of course, I think, having doing something fruitful, but at the same time also having fun and being fair. So these are the 3 F's I try to think of, fun, fair, fruitful, and live a life with no regrets and a lot of caring. And that's so I am passionate about caring, and that means caring about people, caring about problems. And it's the same thing that I'm most thankful for, which is people. My
Perfect.
life is entirely shaped by people, professors, friends, and my own family. So
Perfect. Subi, let's switch gears to talk about research. What are a few of the omitted variables in IB research? And your research is now moving more towards bigger questions. And then I will be asking about what's the next big question in IB that we should be tackling. So what are a few of the omitted variables, things that we have understudied, and then what's the next best thing, the next big question in IB?
So, I think it's there's a, let's say, a puzzle. When we say IB, partly we are thinking at the level of either the economy, which is, or economies, maybe at the level of industry, and eventually maybe the firm. Now, actually, the variable that is worth looking at is human life. And we don't seem to go into that unit. And the whole disappointment that we faced with internationalization and then globalization was neglecting, if you will, the impact on communities and lives and nature. And so we believed in, so I would say the anxiety that individuals have experienced as a result of globalization and this geographic specialization. And I often feel, was this a scalable idea? So is globalization scalable in the sense that if 1 billion people were somehow engaged in international exchange and specialization, okay, but if 2 or 3 billion people are suddenly going to be part of these global value chains and highly diffuse operations and creating a lot of anxiety. So one of the things that market theory teaches us is that voluntary exchange is the best way to get to a Pareto frontier, where at least some people are better off and nobody is worse off. But the form of globalization we seem to have actually witnessed is not always Pareto, and it's often non-Pareto. Some people are better off and others are worse off. And it might look voluntary, but is it really fair? And to me, I wrote an article for some book some years ago, more than 10 years ago, called Jedi Globalization. And I said, if we do, the E in Jedi stands for efficiency. And I said, globalization certainly is about efficiency. And the D is about diversity. So I hope that it's not just the efficiency, it's also the diversity that we should promote that, not just tolerate it and erase diversity. And the J, however, was the neglected part, which is justice. And the I was to integrate these three things. How can we integrate? How can we optimize? Not maximize or minimize, but optimize justice, efficiency, and diversity. And diversity is the only insurance we have for an uncertain future. That's why we say diversify the portfolio, whether it comes to food or even our genetic makeup, when diversity is so crucial. And globalization for a while went into this mode of one size fits all. Let's have fewer currencies, let's have fewer languages. This difference is very costly. And the efficiency pushed us in the direction of these single large factories or large operations because of scale economies and so on. And today, I think understanding this, what Tom Schelling talked about, micro-rational, macro-irrational. So globalization often has this pattern where we see, well, Amazon may be good for me, but if everyone were like me, then we might lose all the local stores and so on. So when we scale these things up into mass adoption, then we get perverse effects and we might have regret. And I think if we could study fairness more, the environment, and especially human life, and understand the non-Pareto unintended consequences of this, how would we go for Jedi globalization as opposed to just the enterprise globalization, which has firms and their performance and the efficiency and specialization at the core.
Perfect. And about creativity, what does your mind think of when it wanders freely in a state of idle curiosity?
Well, I mean, creativity is one thing, and what my mind wanders to is another thing. I think when it comes to creativity, my sense is that it's really the ability to connect dots, and at multi-level, multi-theory, multidisciplinary. And I think this is, and it's not just creative in the sense that there is something original about it, but when you study international business, you are coming to a level of irreducible complexity and a host of contradictions. And if you don't connect dots, you may not get a very coherent picture. You may get, equilibria with contradictions inside. So creativity is to kind of at least make sense of those patterns that we observe. And in terms of when my mind wandering, I think about these puzzles. I'm often prompted by why in the current research that I'm doing, I'm prompted about why is it that some people care? And why is it that some people are then able to commit against that caring? And finally, why is it that some people have the courage to follow through on that commitment? So that is, to me today, the question of character is paramount. And we have focused the last maybe 100 years on understanding competence. We all believe in human capital, and especially the study of multinational firms is really a human capital-centric theory that explains the existence and the success of these firms. But now, I think as we look, ahead, and we see ESG and all of these concerns coming, to me, it's the character, not just the competence of this human capital. So when you make a supply chain, if Apple has a supply chain in China or in India, and the workers there are facing some safety issues or living wage versus, people have talked about arbitrage, etc. We need to talk about how, and I would, this is not about non-market strategy as in stakeholder management. This is really about integrating performance and progress. And it goes to the core of the character of the leaders of this enterprise, whether it's IKEA, whether it's Apple, whether it's Amazon, and of course in the domestic, but especially in the international setting, this is a big deal. So when we look at supply chains, we see that food is grown in Brazil or gold is mined in parts of Africa, and all these questions come up as to how will business, benefit from this different endowments spatially, and do we kind of go to the lowest common denominator? Do we say, do in Rome, as Romans do? Or do we kind of say, there is an idea of progress which can be universal, and how then in a public company would I be able to persuade others that A, it's the right thing to do, and B, we can afford to do this. And that's the only way in which I think the trust issue is going to be addressed. Otherwise, it's not just international business and deglobalization. It's just going to be a long haul. We're going to face more and more compliance and regulation kind of thing. And if we don't want to face discrimination, then I think foreign companies, so trust is a core issue, which we just don't understand well enough. And we're seeing that playing out in the big powers, the big economic powers. How, when I don't trust you, I will discriminate and block your investment and block your, and localize my supply chains. And this will hurt efficiency. So I think these are the kinds of issues, both the macro, but now especially at the micro level. What are these non-cognitive skills? And of course, with the advent of digital, this becomes even more important. Where do I pay my taxes? Where do I keep my jobs? This work from home is also work from anywhere. And somebody today was asked in an interview in the news, this Indian company making vaccines. How do you decide what proportion of your vaccines will you keep for India versus will you export to foreign countries for the COVID vaccine? And this is where the integration has to kind of come in. There is multiple issues of performance, but also important issues, philosophical, moral issues of progress and creating trust. Do we still think in terms of countries, or do we think more broadly that a life saved in Africa is the same as a life saved in India, even if you're an Indian company? This, I think, is something we have not been very good at addressing, and we're still kind of working in the paradigm of countries, which are very useful for many purposes. But when it comes to environmental issues, when it comes to jobs, training, health, and wages, and I think we need to. So that's what I think about when, and so I'm now working with moral psychologists to understand what do they, and some of them are using neuroscience and looking at the imaging of the brain, and we need to get to the bottom of this. We need to come back to people. It's not just business, and it's certainly not. The more we move away from you and me as human beings who want to have the benefits of specialization and exchange, but at the same time, in a way that is fair. So again, I come back to fair and fruitful. If we can make international business fair, it is definitely can be fruitful, but if it's not fair, then it's not fun. And that's what I think about. And I've not even talked about the future generations, but just, taking a one period game, so to speak.
Thank you, Subi. About mentoring, about advice, what was the best advice you received when you were going through the program?
I think listening is really a great thing, and all the courses we do may not be what we need to do our own research. And on the one hand, reading widely and listening. So I think I always used to feel, what happens in the classroom is teaching. Learning happens outside the classroom. And I was encouraged, therefore, to go hang out with my advisors, but also with other professors in other schools and in the area. I mean, I studied in Cambridge, so, you know, there was a lot of faculty and you could meet. And so, and then, so meeting and learning from people is, as opposed to just the coursework. And then a second kind of thing was this notion of triangulation, that social science is so challenging a field. We can't do natural experiments, or we can't do kind of lab experiments, so we have to depend on some natural experiments. And beyond that, the data, you know, what we can measure is very, very unsatisfactory. And so triangulation, looking at cases, looking at the data, looking over time. And so triangulation was always important. Don't take any single test as a test of sufficiency. Keep, you know, being skeptical. And I think the third thing was know your data well. Don't be, you know, even if it's secondary data, know your data really well. Because at the end of the day, if you don't know observations, if you don't know what the data really are and what they're saying and what the source of that is, and how did they produce this data? Because once it appears, I mean, it used to be on paper, but now if it's on the screen, and it's, you know, sounds very accurate when you say 53,000. Okay, it's like, how did you come up with that? What is the methodology by which these data are generated? What we take as facts? What is the truth value of these facts? And how confident are you? And are you going to caveat and qualify that if you build your research or your ideas on that? And so constantly kind of, eventually I had to learn to be comfortable not defending a point of view, but really allowing, you know, the data to speak or the facts to speak, and not being wedded to this hypothesis or that hypothesis. And early on, there is a huge desire to be right, to say something that is right and new and important and so on. And then you just look for confirmatory evidence. You lose that, you know, you become afraid to find out, suppose I'm wrong, because then I don't have a paper, or then I don't have a, you know, novel claim. And gradually kind of letting that go, let the data speak, and just be, you know, scholarship is just that. You look for truth. You may never find it, but at least not because you stopped looking too soon. So these were some of the things that I observed in my advisors, and that's what I picked up. But my learning, as I said, mostly was outside the classroom with people whom I would spend time with and talk about these issues.
Based on the problems that you see, based on the pitfalls that you see common to junior faculty or PhD students, what is your advice? What advice would you give to them?
So I don't have a lot of advice, and it does depend on the person. But, you know, the one difficult thing is to find a meaningful question. And I think not converging too rapidly onto this is my question, or and sometimes when you ask people like, why are you doing that? There isn't a very you know, passionate response. It's just, well, I have this data, or somebody said this and I want to pursue that. So, you know, take time to formulate the question is the first thing. But that immediately leads to the second thing, which is, please know what came before. Because if it is an important question, surely people have written about it earlier. And do you know the classic, do you know the seminal work in this area, whatever work area you choose, whether it's supply chains or whether it is exchange rates or whether it is non-market strategy. What is the seminal work in this area? Who conceptualized this first? And can you show that you know the prior art? And so don't just pick up in the last 5 or 10 years of the journals. Don't be afraid to go digging into the deep history of this so that you feel a certain intimacy and a certain, you appreciate what has gone before. So having this prior art. And finally, the whole issue of explanations and theory. If you have a good question, if you know the prior art, is what you're saying novel and rigorous, not just novel? And what are the alternative explanations? That this disconfirming, this habit of kind of trying to attack your own theory in a honest manner, I think is something that would save time and make life harder, but certainly I would say more meaningful and more likely to at least make the journey interesting. We don't know whether this leads to a destination of getting a job, getting tenure, etc. So there are all these other more immediate pressures. But I think what I have seen is young people sometimes quickly jump to co-authors. It's like misery loves company, or if I'm afraid, if I'm with others, and you're both now working on not so relevant questions. Why would you do that just because somebody else agreed? So don't look for validation from somebody who will, go ask some person that you respect, hey, do you think this question is worth working on? It's going to take me 1, 2, 3 years. Is this a worthwhile question? And if you ask somebody who's, that you respect and who's independent from you, that will be a much better gauge of the validity of this effort you're going to put in than finding co-authors or finding data or finding some papers that talked about that, which you now want to build. That's what I would say.
We're running out of time. So what is one question that I should have asked you but haven't?
Well, I think you've asked a lot of questions. I can't really say there is something that I wish you had asked me. I think, we live in that maybe what I find is that, the question about what are you thankful for? If you had asked me that, because I feel very fortunate to have the kind of life that we have in a world that is so upside down. And for us, all of this complexity and turbulence creates new patterns that we will study. So in a sense, we are very buffered and protected and privileged. And so if you'd asked me, what are you thankful for? I would have said family, friends, and the foundation that we have, which is academic institutions. I'm extremely thankful to INSEAD. I've been here 25 years, and it's such a great platform. We really have liberty to choose the people we spend time with, the topics that we want to deepen our knowledge and advance knowledge on. So this is so being grateful and not just worrying about what all did not happen and may not happen. So forward looking is great, but I think economists are taught only to look forward, not to look at the back. I think look back as well. Your life becomes more, I think, fun and grateful as a result.
Perfect. Thank you so much for your time. I learned a lot. I'm sure the audience will agree with me. Subi, thanks.
Thank you, Ilgaz.